Hi folks, welcome to this tutorial video to show you how to make either the mini Maviti, the regular adult size Maviti sweater, or a number of other patterns of mine. This tutorial is really helpful for a number of techniques that I use across a number of patterns that I've made. But we're going to be making this 2 to 3 year old sized mini Maviti sweater, just as a good way and a quick way to show you how various techniques are used throughout the pattern. So we'll be talking various materials and tools that you'll be using for these. We'll be working, of course, starting from the bottom ribbing, working that mesh stitch, working the collar, and then working the sleeves, of course. All of the pattern PDFs are listed down in the description below, or you can find a number of them on my website as well at shopwavelengths.com. Also got a number of timestamps listed down in the description below, depending on where you are in your project or potentially where you're maybe a little bit stuck and are looking for a little bit more visual guidance. So just have a look down there too to see if you want to skip to any certain part. If you've got your tools and materials ready, you can kind of just jump right into the tutorial and yeah, just use it as you see fit. This tutorial and the information in it is quite transferable to a number of patterns that I've written. So it's just a good way to get an understanding of the construction of my patterns. So let's jump into supplies and materials. So let's talk materials for this pattern, or these patterns rather. So you'll be working with a chunky sized yarn, size 5 here. You can use acrylic, you can use wool, you can use wool mix, you can kind of use whatever you'd like as long as you're meeting the gauge necessary to meet the right tension. So I like to use a lot of paint box yarns coming from Lovecrafts because they have just so many great fun colors to work with. In terms of hooks, you're going to need a 5.5 millimeter hook, a 6.5 millimeter hook, and an, I don't know if you can see it terribly well there, but an 8 millimeter hook. You will need to adjust your hook sizes depending on how your tension works out using when you make your tension square. But these are the hooks that work for me. And then you'll need a tapestry needle just for weaving those ends in. So let's get started with our tension square. So before we get started with the pattern, we need to make a tension square to make sure that we are meeting the right measurements so that the garment will turn out in the right measurements based on the pattern. So for that, for these patterns, our tension square is made using the mesh stitch. So using your 8 millimeter hook or whatever, you might need to adjust your hook size depending on how your tension square goes. So let's start our tension square. So we're gonna do our slip knot here, pull it through. And for most of my patterns using the mesh stitch in the chunky size yarn, you're gonna chain 16. Next up, we're going to start our mesh stitch right away. So we're going to go into every other chain of your initial chain here. So you're going to do a single crochet going in that second chain from the hook, chain 1, skip 1, and we're going to go into that third one there. Single crochet again, chain 1, skip 1, keep going all the way along until you've got 8 mesh stitch, which I count 1 mesh stitch as the single crochet plus the chain. And then when you get to the end there, you've just got the 1 more single crochet in that last chain. Oops. And then you'll still do that chain 1, and this is where you'll turn. So this is what it's looking like so far. So to continue with your mesh stitch, we're going to go into the single crochets from the previous row, not the chain spaces. That will make it the moss stitch versus the mesh. So you did your chain 1, you're going to go into that single crochet from the previous row, do another single crochet there, chain 1, skip that chain space, and you're going to go into the next single crochet from the previous row. So to meet the gauge, you need to do 13 rows of this. So you're just going to keep going back and forth, and I'll meet you when we're at the 13th row. So we're coming up to the end of my tension swatch here. I've got 8 mesh stitch going across, and I've got 13 rows up. I've got 3 more stitches here. 1, 2, 3. So this is what our square looks like. We're going to use a handy dandy tape measure here so we can see that the height is 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and the width is just about 4 inches and 10 centimeters. So I'm good to go with my 8mm hook. If your square is coming out too small, then you need to use a bigger hook. If your square is coming out too big, then look to using a smaller hook. There is two hook sets listed in the patterns that I have out there. It's just generally people who are looser crocheters have generally worked with that set that is recommended for looser crocheters. So definitely play around with your hooks and see what works for you. And then once you get that 10 by 10 square with 13 rows up and 8 stitches across, then you're good to go to get started. So as I've mentioned at the top of the video for this one, for this tutorial, I will be making the mini Maviti sweater in the size 2 to 3-year-old. But these techniques and everything that I'm going to show you here is really transferable between a number of my patterns. The mini Maviti, of course, the Maviti sweater, the Roland sweater, the Bodwin pullover. There's a number of patterns that use these techniques, so quite interchangeable and can be helpful in a number of spots. When it comes to bottom ribbing, this is where we get started. So I use a 5.5mm hook. It's suggested to use a hook that is 2.5mm smaller than the hook that you got the right tension for your tension square. So I use an 8mm hook for my mesh stitch. So I'll use a 5.5 when it comes to the ribbing. So let's get started. First of all, the numbers are going to be a little bit different from pattern to pattern and from adult to children's size patterns. All of the patterns are listed down in the description below so that you can get the right number of stitches, right numbers of rows, everything like that. You can find that in the pattern PDFs. But for this example, as I mentioned, we're making the mini Maviti in the size 2 to 3, so we'll be using those numbers for that. So let's get started with our sweater. So like with the tension square, you're going to start with your slip knot here. You're going to do a chain 9. So it'll look like this. So starting your first row of ribbing, you're going to skip that first chain from the hook. You're going to go into that second one and just do a single crochet and single crochet all the way back down, and you'll end up with 8 single crochets. So it'll look a little something like this. When you get down there, you'll do your chain 1 and you'll turn, and this is where you're going to start working back loop only to create that ribbing. So again, we're going to skip that first chain from the hook, going just into that back loop and pulling your yarn through and doing your single crochet. always just in that back loop. You're going to do 8 of those. When you get to the end, do that final single crochet there, chain 1, and you'll turn again. And then once again, going along this way, you're going to go back loop only. So skipping that first chain from the hook, going right into that back loop, pulling through, single crochet. I'm going to go all the way across there. Cool. So I'm going to do a few more rows of this, and then we'll pause, and I'll show you how you can count your rows of ribbing. That's just a little bit easier to count, and we'll keep going from there. So here's what this first little bit of ribbing is looking like. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 rows going on here. And the way that I like to count my rows, so we've got peaks going on here, and then the valleys are in between here. So I like to count all of the peaks as 2 rows. So we're going 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And then I just keep going like that. 2, 4, 6, 8, 20, 2, 4, 6, 8, 30, etc., etc. So depending on which pattern you're working on and what size you're making, there's going to be a different number of rows for the bottom ribbing. So just keep going until what's noted in the pattern PDF that you are working on. And we'll meet you at the end of this row. So for the Mini Maviti, the 2 to 3 year old, I'm going to be working 48 rows of ribbing. So I'll meet you at the end there. All right, so I finished my 48 rows of ribbing for the first panel that we're working on. So I've got my last one here with my hook in there, but for the next row, we're going to be working up on top here. And I'm going to be switching my 5.5 millimeter hook to the 6.5, or anything that is 1.5 millimeters smaller than the hook that you obtained the gauge with for the mesh stitch, sorry. So for this row, as I mentioned, we're going to be working on top here, the long side here. We're going to be working a series of single crochets, but every once in a while, depending on the size that you're making and whether it's the adult or children's size, this sequence will look a little bit different. So every once in a while, we'll be doing 2 single crochets in the same stitch, or an increase. This will help us get a little bit of a bow, a little bit of a bow shape going on here, so that it's a little bit tighter around the waist, and then a little bit bigger ballooning on top. So for the Mini Maviti here, I'm gonna do 15 single crochets, and it kind of alternates between it being, one of them is really easy, and then the other one is a little bit like tighter to go through. But you're just going at the top of every ribbing row that you've been working. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to be doing 14 just on their own. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is 14 here, and on that 15th stitch, this is where I'm going to do my increase. So I'm going to do 2 single crochets in the same stitch there. And then I'm going to do the same sequence again. So I'm going to do 14 just on their own. And this is my 14th one here. So going to do another increase here, which is just, which is just the 2 single crochets in the same stitch. So depending what pattern that you're working on and what size that you're doing, it doesn't really matter where your increases happen along the way, as long as they're spread out even or somewhat evenly across the way. You don't want to have them all bunched up in one place, or else it gets a little bit wonky. So you're just going to keep going until you get to the end there and following your sequence. So I'm getting near the end there. I just did 14 again. I'm gonna do my increase on that 15th stitch. And for this size, my row finishes with just 3 on their own. 1, 2, and the last one's always a little bit tricky, but I'm sure you can find it. 3. So that's what that looks like. Here you can see it's kind of doing that curved shape, totally fine. With this, after this color, I'm actually going to switch to a different color. So I've got my scissors, and I'm just going to fasten off this yellow color. You've got the bottom ribbing done. So let's start working that body, working with the mesh stitch. So with the hook that you use to reach that gauge, so for me it's that 8mm hook, this is what we're going to be using for the main body and the sleeves of these sweaters. So I'm going to be working a purple stripe now. I tend to just fasten on, nothing fancy. If you have another technique you'd like to use, go for it. I just do my 1 knot here like that. And then this side is going to end up being my wrong side. So this is going to be on the inside of the sweater, but I'm going to have all the tails hanging out in there. But we'll weave them in at the end also. So you'll pull your yarn through into that first single crochet. You'll do a chain 1, and then you're going to go through again and kind of work a single crochet that way. So we're going to be working across that row of single crochets you did just before. And similar to the swatch, we're going to be going into every other single crochet going across. So we went into that first one there. We're going to skip this one, and we're going to go into that third one. I like to have my tails of yarn included in 2 or 3 stitches when I'm starting. That's not enough to weave them in. After that, we're still going to want to weave them in 2 more ways. But this is a nice way to start it and to cut down a little bit on the weaving time. So we've got 2 there. We're going to skip this one here, and we're going to go into that next one where we're going to single crochet, chain 1. This is where I drop the tails usually. So again, we're skipping 1, and we're going to go to that next one there. And we're going to just keep going across all the way. I'll meet you when we're at the end over here. So I'm getting near the end of my first row of mesh stitch for the body here. I've got 1 here, and I've got 1 more single crochet to finish the row there. So we'll do our single crochet, chain 1, and then we'll turn. And then we're gonna just keep going back and forth like that, working the mesh stitch as you saw in the gauge swatch, sorry. So we'll be working our single crochet of the mesh stitch in the single crochet of the previous row, not the chain space, or else that becomes the moss stitch. So we're just going to keep going back and forth. Try and slow it down a little bit here. So in, out, going all the way across. So of course you can work with whatever stripe pattern that you'd like to work with. With the stripes I'm doing here, I'm doing 4 rows of mesh stitch for each color. A good and nice way to count your stitches is that you sort of count the V's. So you can see easily when there's a color switch where that first V is. And then the next one after that, I call it a bit of an italic V. So it's a little bit slanted. It's a little bit more slanted on the side there, and then it's more regular, and then it's more slanted. So that's how I count my rows. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. So you'll be working, depending on which pattern you're working on, what size you're working on, there's going to be a different number of rows that you'll be doing for the mesh stitch. So it'll end up looking a little bit something like this. This is what the wrong side looks like with all those tails hanging out. So we've got that first part of them being woven in, but then there's 2 more parts to it to really secure it. So we'll work on that after. So keep working on your body here. I'm going to do the 4 rows of purple with this one, and then when I get to the end of the 4 rows, I'm going to show you the color switch one more time, and then I'll leave you to it to get the body panel done, and then we'll move on to the shoulder extensions. So keep working away. Feel free to pause, feel free to throw on some tunes and really get into the swing of things, and we'll see you shortly. So I'm getting to the end of my 4th row of that stripe of purple that I'm working on. So I've got 2 more mesh stitch to work. So I'm doing 1 and 2. And here I'm going to fasten off. So I'm going to do that yarn over and pull through and get rid of that. And now I'm going for a stripe of orange. So similar to what we did down here, I'm gonna just fasten on my orange yarn. I just do it with a knot. If you have another technique you prefer to use, please be my guest. So I'm gonna pull in, chain 1, and I'm gonna do 1 more of those. And that sets up that single crochet at the end of the row. So we'll do our chain 1. Again, I'm going to carry those tails for about 3 stitches, and that'll be my first part of them being woven in. So we've got the 3 there. I'm going to tuck those down now, and I'm just going to keep going along with this new color for 4 more stripes. 4 more rows to create that stripe. And as you saw in the example earlier, we've got 4 colors for this one. Please feel free to use however many or however little colors that you'd like. And there's all sorts of stripe combinations out there. Feel free to have a look on Instagram with the various hashtags such as Maviti sweater, mini Maviti. You can also check out AZL cardigan and a number of those. I'll list those out in the description below. So keep going with the, depending on what size that you're making and what style that you're making, however many rows of mesh stitch you need to do. And once we've got this much done, we're going to work on the shoulder extensions up here. So we'll see you in a little bit. Okay, so let's start working those shoulder extensions. So we've got our top for here in the yellow, so we're going to go back to purple here. Similar to what we've been doing before, I'm going to fasten on this purple. And set myself up. So for this 2 to 3 year old mini Maviti size, I'm going to be working the mesh stitch, but I'm basically going to be working short rows. So for the 2 to 3 year old, I'm going to be working 8 mesh stitch across and then going back here, and then we're going to fasten off. Then we're going to go back to this side where we're going to do the same thing. So we've got 1, 2, 8. So you do, when you get to that 8th or whatever number it is that you're doing for the pattern and the size that you're working on, so you do that last one there, you do your chain 1 as you normally would, and then I'm going to turn. So I'm just stopping the row short. So for the next row, we're going to do another 8. basically with all of my patterns, the outside edge is always going to be flat, and that sort of ladder steps that we're going to end up having here is always going to be within the collar there, and that's kind of what's going to be shaping the collar. So this is row 2 of the shoulder extension for the mini Maviti for size 2 to 3. I'm going to be working my 8 there. And 8. We'll do our chain 1. We're going to turn again. And for rows 3 and 4, I'm only going to be working 7. So again, we're going to be going 1 short from the row that we did before. So 7. So we got 1 short there. We're going to turn. We're going to do the 7 again, going back. So for the mini Maviti in the size 2 to 3, this is what the shoulder extension is going to look like. Nothing more than that. For the 2 larger sizes of the mini Maviti, you'll be doing 1 more row going across. For the adult sizes, there is a little bit more going on there because we're a little bit bigger than children. But yeah, so for this size, we are done. And we can fasten off on one of your panels. So on this one, I'm going to leave them short, but on one of your panels, leave a bit of a longer tail, and that's what the yarn that you can use that when we're sewing the 2 panels to get the 2 shoulder panels together, and we can use that tail to sew it together. So for the other side, because we want the steps to still be on the inside, there is going to be a little bit of a difference here that it just feels a little bit different. So because we'll be working on the opposite side that we normally work our mesh stitch on, it's just that first row is going to feel a little bit odd. But we'll fasten off on, or sorry, we're going to fasten on the outside there. Try and keep your tail within the inside so that it like is in the same area as your other tails. You don't have to pull it through. So we're going to set this up. So that's our first one there. So for this one, because the V is a little bit in that different position and it's not what you're necessarily used to, I'm going in this spot, like right, this hole right here. You can see my nail poking through there. That's where I'm going in. So we've got 2, 3. So you can already kind of see the neck forming here, right? So we've done our 8, we did our chain 1 at the end of that. And then once you turn around, it'll go back to how you've been doing it before. So no more awkwardness. It just happens that one time on both panels, ensuring that our short rows are in the correct, position for the neck. And then we'll do our row with the 7 mesh stitch. So just ending that 1 stitch short. So no decreases happening. We're just stopping the row short. And then we've got our 7th one there, And we can fasten this off. Oops. And this is what our first panel is looking like. So you'll be making two identical panels like this, with one of them leaving longer tails in the shoulder extension so that when you put them together, you can just use that tail to sew them together. So you'll be making two of these, and then we'll sew them together. Then we'll work the collar, and then we'll work the sleeves. So that's what we've got going on.